The bullet hit her at 4:47 in the morning. The second one came 3 seconds later. Neither one put her down. That was the first thing Roland Briggs would remember years afterward when people asked him how it all began. Not the firefight, not the mountain, not the cold that had settled into the valley like something ancient, impatient, pressing down from the Hindu Kush with the indifference of geology. He would remember the sound she made, which was nothing. No scream, no gasp, no sharp intake of breath that comes from people who have just been reminded violently that they are mortal. There was only the crack of incoming fire, the impact, and then silence from the woman who had just been hit twice. A silence that was somehow louder than the gunshots themselves. Roland Briggs had spent 31 years around men who had been shot. He had packed wounds in jungles and deserts and places that appeared on no map the public would ever see. He knew every sound a human body made when a bullet found it. He knew the difference between a man who was going down and a man who was deciding whether to go down. What he witnessed that morning was something he had seen only once before in his life, and the man who had shown it to him was supposed to be dead. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier in the pre-dawn stillness of FOB Ridgeline. Forward Operating Base Ridgeline sat at 6,800 feet in the Kunar province of eastern Afghanistan, wedged between two ridgelines that channeled wind from the Hindu Kush like a cold blade held flat against the skin. October had arrived the way it always arrived in this part of the world, sudden and without negotiation, turning September's dust into frost by midnight and back into dust by noon. The base was small, 26 people total. Half of them Delta Force operators under Captain Marcus Vane. The rest were support personnel, communications, logistics, intelligence. And one Navy corpsman who had been added to the manifest at the last minute by an order originating 3 levels above Vane's authority, accompanied by no explanation whatsoever. Her name was listed as Ward T. Petty Officer 2nd Class. Navy corpsman previously assigned to Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. Her file was clean, standard. The kind of file that answered every surface question and revealed nothing beneath. Briggs had read it twice on the flight in, and a third time sitting in the briefing room watching her through the scratched plexiglass of the door. She was alone at a metal table working through her medical kit with methodical patience that took years to build. Not checking supplies the way a nervous person checks them, compulsively seeking reassurance in familiar objects. She was conducting an audit. Every item removed, examined, repositioned. Her hands moved with the rhythm of someone for whom this sequence was so deeply grooved that thinking about it would only introduce friction. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, 118 pounds in full kit. Dark brown hair pulled back from a face that was younger than its eyes. Those eyes were the problem. Eyes at 26 move. They search for social cues. They register uncertainty and negotiate constantly with an unpredictable world. They carry the readable texture of youth. Hers were still, not vacant, not cold, still the way deep water is still without effort as a natural condition, still the way only a very small number of people ever become still through a specific kind of experience accumulated over a specific kind of time. Roland Briggs had spent 31 years earning eyes like that. He wanted to know how she had gotten hers at 26. Captain Marcus Vane was 48 years old, built for a singular purpose he had never deviated from, with an operational record that existed in classified files rather than public commendations. He found Briggs in the equipment room 20 minutes before the briefing and arrived at the point the way he arrived at every point. "Tell me why there's a corpsman on this manifest." Briggs set down the bag he was inventorying. "Same reason you are. Someone made a decision." "I made calls. Nobody's explaining it." The set of Vane's jaw communicated controlled frustration more precisely than his words. "This is direct action. We go in fast, pull Forsyth out, and leave. I need shooters. I don't need a field medic slowing my egress. I'm the field medic on this mission. You're a SEAL veteran who spent 22 years keeping operators alive in combat. That's different." Vane paused. "She's a corpsman from Portsmouth." Briggs looked through the doorway. She was still at the table, still auditing, hadn't looked up once. "Keep her behind the line," Vane said. "She patches people up if we take casualties on the way out. That's what she's here for." Briggs nodded. He didn't say what he was thinking because he wasn't sure yet what he was thinking. Only that the stillness in her eyes had settled somewhere in the back of his mind like a piece of information waiting for context. The briefing took 35 minutes. Dr. Elaine Forsyth, 50-years-old American, had been taken 14 days earlier from a forward research station in the Shell Valley. Her official work classification was Environmental Science Atmospheric Monitoring at Altitude. 3 classification levels above that, she was something else entirely. Briggs didn't know what and hadn't asked. Knowing why you were going somewhere had never made the going easier. The compound four structures at the base of a rocky escarpment, 8 to 12 armed personnel. Dr. Forsyth held in the northeast building. The plan was clean. Three-element approach breach extract egress to the pickup zone 1.4 kilometers southeast. Helicopter at 0530 if the timeline held. Briggs watched the briefing the way he always watched them from the edge of the room, reading not just the information, but how each person received it. Vane absorbed it without visible reaction. His team processed it individually. Holloway, the oldest operator at 44, nodded at intervals that suggested long familiarity with this mission type. Mercer, 24, and the youngest in the room, leaned forward with the unconscious eagerness of someone who hadn't yet learned to conserve energy before the work began. Kowalski stood with crossed arms and the expression of a man conducting a rapid categorical assessment of everyone present, deciding in advance what each person was capable of filing the decisions moving on. She stood near the back. Kowalski had positioned himself slightly to her left, blocking her sightline to the eastern half of the map. Not deliberately hostile, simply the way a man like him organized a room around his assumptions about who mattered in it. She didn't move to compensate. She stood where she was, and Briggs watched her eyes make small, continuous adjustments, reading what she could see, reconstructing what she couldn't from the topographical logic available to her. That was the moment something shifted in him, from observation to question. Who taught her to read a room like that? Holloway materialized at his shoulder, quiet enough that Briggs hadn't heard him coming. You see it, Holloway said, barely above the room's ambient noise. I see it. She's reading egress angles, not medical staging positions. Egress angles. Briggs said nothing. 19 years, Holloway said. Medics don't do that. The briefing ended. People moved to their equipment. Briggs carried the question to the pre-dawn equipment check, where it acquired its first concrete evidence. The Barrett M82A1 was in its transport case near the south wall of the armory, and Green, the team's designated marksman, was pulling it out with the careful attention the weapon demanded. 30 pounds of precision engineering, 50B, MG, a round that communicated a specific and unambiguous message at distances most shooters never attempted. She was passing through the armory when Green began mounting the bipod. She stopped. A fractional pause. Her eyes moved to the weapon the way eyes move towards something recognized from a long distance, something that has been out of sight but never fully out of mind. Her right hand came up from her side to approximately the height of the Barrett's receiver. Her index finger moved one small involuntary contraction, the muscle memory of a specific grip and a specific weight, and then her hand dropped, and she walked on without looking back. Briggs stood in the doorway. He had seen that gesture before. Not the gesture itself, but the origin of it, the way the body surfaces, what the mind is managing not to acknowledge, the way training lives below the threshold of conscious control and emerges in unguarded moments. She was holding something in reserve. The question had an outline now. He wasn't ready to name it, but the outline was there, precise and increasingly difficult to look away from. 3 hours before launch, the situation that should have been a serious problem, and would have been for everyone, was sitting unreported in plain sight. Specialist Cody Mercer was 24 years old and built with the physical solidity of someone from good farming stock somewhere in the interior of the country. He mentioned the headache the way young soldiers mention headaches, briefly, dismissively, in the tone of someone establishing that they are not the kind of person who is stopped by minor inconvenience. Kowalski heard it, told him Motrin and sleep, reasonable advice given the available information. She was 12 feet away, loading supplies, and something changed in her hands when she heard it, a fractional pause. The kind that happens when attention reroutes itself before the conscious mind finishes processing. She closed her bag. She walked to Mercer and sat down across from him without being invited. When did the headache start? Yesterday afternoon. It's nothing. The vehicle impact yesterday morning. Where were you seated? A pause. Rear left. Did your head contact the frame? Maybe. Briefly. I was wearing my helmet. She ran a neurological assessment with quiet, systematic efficiency, tracking response latency, balance, calibration. Then she listened to his breathing for 30 full seconds. Not because she needed 30 seconds, because she was thorough in a way that could not be rushed without becoming something less than thorough. When she stood, she went directly to Vane. Mercer has a developing tension pneumothorax in his right lung, subclinical now. At sea level, probably manageable tonight. At this altitude, under sustained exertion, there's a real risk of partial collapse during the approach. He needs to be evaluated before we move. Vane's face held. You're confident? Yes, sir. Kowalski was 8 feet away. We don't have time. I know the timeline, she said without raising her voice, without turning toward him. I'm telling you because if Mercer goes down on the approach, you lose your left flank cover at the moment of breach. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is being decided. Vane looked at Briggs. Second opinion. Briggs examined Mercer. 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, she's right. The mission delayed 3 hours. She performed the needle decompression herself, the technique precise practiced, entirely absent of the hesitation that appears in people doing something for the first or second time. When she finished, she returned to her kit without acknowledgement, without any indication that she had done something unusual. Holloway found Briggs afterward near the equipment cages. First time I've seen Kowalski without a comment, Holloway said. He'll have one later. Maybe. Holloway looked across the compound to where she sat back at her inventory. She wasn't making a point. She just saw it and fixed it. That's what's getting me. Briggs nodded. The question had a shape now, and the shape was pushing toward a name he wasn't ready to say. The convoy pushed out at 03:15. The valley received them in darkness and cold, and the silence of high-altitude terrain at night, not peaceful so much as suspended like a breath being held. The Hindu Kush stars were extraordinary in their quantity and their indifference to everything occurring beneath them. Briggs moved third in the formation. She moved fifth. She moved the way the experienced operators moved, not loudly, not in a way that displaced the air or disturbed rocks underfoot. Each footfall placed with care. Holloway dropped back briefly to walk level with Briggs, indicated with a small tilt of his head toward her silhouette against the mountain dark. She was covering the 270 to 300-degree arc, the zone that fell into no one's primary responsibility, in a standard wedge formation. The zone experienced operators covered from habit, and newer ones forgot until it mattered. She covered it without announcement, without any expectation that anyone was watching. Briggs was watching. The question was no longer a question. It was a name held just below the surface, waiting for the moment when saying it out loud would mean something beyond speculation. The compound appeared at 0441, against the sky releasing its darkness at the eastern edge. 4 structures in a tight cluster at the base of a rocky escarpment. The drone intelligence had been accurate. Vane hand-signaled the formation into approach positions, the choreography of men who had done this enough times that spoken instruction was redundant. She settled into the medical staging position behind the breach team. Her kit was open items pre-staged in a sequence that Briggs recognized as organized around the most probable casualty scenarios in order of likelihood, a prioritization that required having worked through the mission profile tactically, not medically. He was about to say something. He hadn't decided what. Then the shooting started. It came from a position the drone hadn't mapped, a natural crevice in the escarpment, 20 meters northeast of the compound perimeter, occupied by a single guard who had chosen comfort over his assigned post and was now making the most consequential error of his life. He fired twice. Both rounds found her. The first entered her left shoulder at an angle suggesting the guard was above, and to her left, passing through muscle and tissue without finding bone. The second grazed her right side, cutting through the lateral gap in her body armor and drawing a long, clean line through the flesh beneath. She went to one knee. Only one. For exactly the duration of the assessment that was required. Then she came back up. Briggs saw it from 11 feet away. He saw the impact translate through her body. He saw the automatic physiological response, the knee, dropping the weight, shifting the momentary disruption of a body absorbing damage. And then he saw something override it. Not willpower performed for an audience. Something structural, something settled and unconflicted. A decision about what her body was going to do that existed below the level of thought. She reached into her kit with her right hand. Combat gauze pressed against the entry point with calibrated pressure. Correct pressure, not frantic pressure, held for the correct duration with the biomechanical knowledge of someone who had done this in conditions where errors had consequences. She used her teeth to tear the bandage wrap. She applied compression, one-handed in the dark, at an angle that required understanding of what was happening inside the wound, not just at the surface. 40 seconds. Then, without pause or transition, she turned toward Mercer. He had gone down in the initial volley. Left thigh, the blood was bad. Her voice when she spoke was level in the way measuring instruments are level without effort, without performance, because levelness was its resting state. Femoral artery, tourniquet, both hands on it. Kowalski was the closest non-engaged operator. 1 second of system shock, not fear the specific arrest of a person watching something that shouldn't be possible, and then he was moving, dropping to Mercer's side following the instruction with the instant execution of someone who recognized authority when he heard it regardless of where it was coming from. She guided Kowalski's hands to the exact position required, her left arm at reduced function, but operational, her eyes simultaneously assessing the rest of the contact zone. The guard in the crevice was still active. She processed this the way a chess player processes a piece that has become relevant. She finished the tourniquet. Guidance confirmed the pressure checked Mercer's wrist pulse. Whatever she found was acceptable. She stood up, reached past Kowalski, and picked up Mercer's rifle from where it had fallen. Holloway made a sound very small, the sound of a model of the world being revised mid-operation. She raised the weapon, found the crevice in the darkness. Her breathing shifted into a pattern Briggs recognized in the first second, not the four-count box breathing taught in military respiratory courses, but something with a longer exhale, a particular pause at the bottom of the breath cycle when the body is at its most still. He had seen that specific pattern twice in his professional life. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. One shot. The crevice went quiet. The contact zone went quiet. For a long moment, no one spoke. The cold moved down from the mountain and across the compound and continued on its way without interest in what had just happened, and 6 men stood in various states of arrested motion, processing an event for which none of them had an immediate category. Kowalski was still kneeling beside Mercer. He was looking at her. His arms were no longer crossed. He had the expression of a man who has been handed a different document than the one he thought he had already read. Vane spoke because commanders speak when forward movement requires it. Green is down, adjusted plan, Ward, you stay with the element. You do what you do. She had already turned back to Mercer to verify the tourniquet placement a second time. Yes, sir, she said. Briggs had not moved. He was 62 years old and had stood in more foreign countries than he could list without a written record. He had built his entire career on the ability to see people accurately, to read what was real versus performed, what was trained versus innate, what a person had been taught versus what a person had become. He was looking at her. And the name that had been waiting below the surface since the armory, since the briefing room, since the first time he had seen her eyes, that name was no longer speculation. He didn't say it out loud. Not yet. Names like that had weight and history and consequence. Names like that reopened files that had been closed for 26 years, and once a file like that opened, it could not be closed again. He put the name away. He moved forward because the mission wasn't finished. But the name was there, absolute and pressing, and nothing about the next several hours was going to be simple. Ahead of him, Tessa Ward moved through the dark with a packed shoulder wound and completely steady hands toward a stone compound where a woman named Forsyth was waiting to be found. The breach took 4 minutes. Clean, fast, organized in the way that operators with hundreds of collective hours in similar structures organize themselves without wasted motion, without uncertainty about who went where and when. Dr. Elaine Forsyth was in the northeast room, bound at the wrists, blindfolded, dehydrated, frightened in the controlled manner of someone who had made a decision to survive and had been holding to that decision through 2 weeks of captivity. Vane cut her restraints. She stood without assistance, which told Briggs everything he needed to know about her. The situation at that moment was recoverable. One operator down with a destroyed shoulder joint. One corpsman wounded and functional. Egress route open. Helicopter 17 minutes out. Then the intelligence failed. The drone assessment had counted 8 to 12 personnel across a 72-hour observation window. Drone observation is accurate until it isn't, and what it most reliably misses is the person who is not where they are expected to be. The shooter above the southeastern ridge had not appeared in any of the footage. He was there now. His first round passed close enough to Vane's ear that Vane heard the air displaced. Everyone went flat. The shooter was elevated behind a natural stone shelf at approximately 820 meters, in a position that covered the entire pickup zone and everything between it and the compound. No one could reach him before the helicopter arrived. Vane looked at Green propped against the interior wall, right arm destroyed. Can you work it? Negative, flat informational. Shoulders done, can't acquire. Vane looked at the Barrett lying on the ground. Then he looked across the courtyard at her. She was 20 feet away, rechecking Mercer's tourniquet, her left arm at reduced function, the shoulder wound seeping at the bandage edges. She hadn't asked for anything since the initial contact. She had been in continuous motion doing what needed to be done, leaving everything else to the people whose job everything else was. He crossed the courtyard in 8 steps, knelt beside her. When he spoke, his voice carried the register of a commander presenting options rather than issuing orders. Green is down. We have a shooter at 820 elevated, are covering our egress. 16 minutes before the helicopter arrives. He paused. Can you work the Barrett? She didn't answer immediately. She finished the tourniquet check, assessed Mercer's color and alertness with a sweep that took 2 seconds and gathered more than most people could gather in 2 minutes. Then she looked at Vane. Yes, sir. She stood up, walked to Green, reached past him and lifted the Barrett clear with her right hand, the specific motion of someone who knew the weapon's weight and balance before touching it, who had a relationship with it that predated this moment. She moved to the northern edge of the outer wall and lowered herself to the ground. The bipod locked into position. The scope aligned. She adjusted the eye relief by feel by the specific relationship between her face and this equipment that existed in the part of the nervous system that doesn't forget. Briggs moved to a position 7 feet back and to her right. He was not there to help. He was there to watch. She found the shooter's position. 820 meters. Altitude. Pre-dawn low light. A weapon zeroed by a different shooter in a different shooting position, requiring compensation that had to be calculated rather than assumed. The margin for error at that distance was measured in fractions of degrees. She breathed. That specific pattern, the longer exhale, the pause at the bottom, the silence in the body before the shot. He had seen this twice. The second time was now. She fired. The round struck the stone shelf 6 inches left of the shooter's position. Dust and fragments scattered across the cover. She had already begun the reload sequence. She chambered the next round, adjusted the scope, a small deliberate correction made without urgency, and fired again. The elevated position went still. 820 meters. One correction, one hit, left shoulder compromised, borrowed 0. Pre-dawn. The valley absorbed the echo and returned to its silence. Vane was looking at the ridge. Holloway was looking at her. Kowalski was looking at the Barrett as though it had done something he did not yet understand. She had already begun field clearing the weapon. Post-firing inspection, systematic and thorough. She broke it down to transportable configuration and returned it to Green's carry system with the same careful attention she had used to remove it. Then she went back to Mercer. 14 minutes until the helicopter. They moved. 1. 4 kilometers through terrain that was demanding in darkness with 1 non-ambulatory casualty, 1 wounded corpsman and a civilian, 2 weeks from regular food and water. Vane set the pace. Holloway and Garrett managed Green. Briggs moved with Forsyth, monitoring at intervals and finding her more capable than her condition advertised. She had rationed herself carefully through captivity, and the discipline of that self-management showed in how she walked. Tessa moved to Mercer's left side without instruction, matching his pace, compensating for the drift in his left foot with the continuous subtle adjustments of someone whose attention was never on a single thing. At 400 meters covered the landing zone, appeared at the edge of night vision, a flat saddle between ridge lines wide enough for 1 helicopter, bounded on the north by a rock formation, rising 30 meters above the surrounding terrain. The shot came from that formation. Single round, military caliber, high velocity. It struck the ground 8 feet from Vane, and the sound arrived a fraction of a second after impact. The shooter was far enough out that physics had separated the bullet from its own noise. Everyone went flat. Vane swept the rock formation and found the shooter in 3 seconds. 1 man prone behind a natural parapet at the formation's crest. The position covered the entire saddle and everything approaching it. The angle made ground-level approach impossible before the helicopter arrived. He looked at her. She was already on her stomach 7 meters to his left. The Barrett deployed bipod down, scope aligned. Her left arm was braced against the earth rather than loaded against the shoulder. Her right hand was at the grip. Distance, she said. Briggs had the laser rangefinder. 1,140 meters. Wind northwest 7 to 9 miles per hour consistent. A pause that was calculation, not hesitation. She was running the ballistics bullet drop at 1,140 meters wind drift on that flight path. Elevation correction for the firing angle, the additional compensation required because she was not the person who had zeroed this weapon. Kowalski was prone to Briggs's right, watching through his optic. His expression had moved beyond its last available category. He was watching with the full attention of a professional who has encountered something that has revised his understanding of what human capability looks like. She exhaled, the long exhale, the pause at the bottom. She fired. Silence from the formation for 2 full seconds. Then the shooter's position changed from occupied to permanently vacated. 140 meters. 1 shot. Left shoulder compromised. No preparation time. Borrowed 0. Nobody spoke. Holloway said 1 word quietly with the gravity of someone making a formal record of something witnessed. He said it once and didn't repeat it. Vane was already on the radio bringing the helicopter in. The window was still open. Kowalski rose to his feet and looked at Briggs with the expression of a man who has closed a file and reopened it in a completely different location. He looked at her once. Then he returned to his position. The helicopter arrived 7 minutes later. On the aircraft, 11 minutes of noise and urgency and the particular compression of a casualty evacuation. Briggs sat across from her and watched her work. Mercer tended to Green, conducted her own ongoing self-assessment with the same undivided attention she applied to everything else. He waited until she finished with Green. "Your name is Tessa Ward," he said. She looked at him across the noise. "Ward is your mother's name," he said. Something shifted in her eyes, not surprise, but the recognition of someone realizing a conversation has arrived at its true beginning. "My mother's maiden name," she said. "She was Patricia Ward before she married Daniel Calloway." Briggs let that sit for a moment. "Commander James Warden," he said. "SEAL Team 6, call sign Ghost. Declared killed in action, Mogadishu, October 4th, 1993. He paused. "I was assigned to bring him out. I was 40 seconds late. There was no body. There was never a body. They told me he was gone, and I spent 31 years believing it." She reached into her kit vest and removed something small, worn at its creases from years of handling. A photograph. She held it out. He took it. An older man on a high slope above the tree line, standing next to a younger version of the person across from him, both holding rifles. The posture between them was not instructor and student. It carried something with more history in it than that. He recognized the older man's face immediately despite the years that had reworked it. The architecture of the jaw, the way the eyes sat, the quality of someone who was never entirely off watch. He held the photograph without speaking. "He's alive," Briggs said. "He was alive when that was taken. 2017. He disappeared again 8 months ago." He said the next part didn't need him. Only what he left behind. She paused. "He knew they'd move when I moved. He built everything around the assumption that the only way this worked was to put me in a position where delivering it was possible." Her voice held its instrument-level quality. "He spent 6 years making sure I could survive long enough to do it." "Deliver what?" Briggs said. But he already knew the shape of the answer. The 11 heat signatures Vane had found on the satellite feed just before extraction. The contractor element using CIA encrypted channels. The mission that had originated above Vane's briefing room. "Someone sent those signatures after us," he said. "Someone who needed me not to leave this valley," she said. "Decker," Briggs said. She looked at him steadily. "You know the name," she said. "I'm starting to," he said. The helicopter descended. Below them, FOB ridgeline resolved from darkness. And in Briggs's mind, 31 years of a specific weight began to reorganize itself around a truth that was going to change everything built on the version he had believed. He folded the photograph carefully and held it out to her. She took it. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the descent. The base received them at 0541 under the first thin light of an Afghan October dawn. Green went to surgical. Mercer went to medical. Doctor. Forsyth went directly to the intelligence debrief room, which communicated institutional priorities with clarity. Vane moved to the operations center and began the post-operational sequence with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Kowalski sat on the low wall outside the medical building with his helmet on his knee looking at it. Holloway sat beside him. After several minutes, Holloway said something. Kowalski responded. Then both men were quiet. She came out of the medical building 15 minutes after handoff and sat down on a crate near the east wall conducting a damage assessment of her own left shoulder with the clinical detachment of someone examining a patient who happened to share her body. Briggs walked to where she sat and settled beside her. Same orientation, looking at the same gray ground. The posture of two people with a conversation that needed to happen at the pace it required rather than the pace convenience preferred. She kept working on her shoulder. "The shoulder needs imaging," he said. "I know. You'll go to medical when we're done." "All right." He let the silence sit. Outside the wall, the base emerged from its night posture, generators shifting loads, vehicles repositioning, the low register of a forward installation beginning its day. "James Ward didn't die at Mogadishu," Briggs said. "He was pressured to disappear, and the person who applied that pressure was on our mission brief." She looked at him. "I pulled Decker's name before the deployment," Briggs said. "I didn't know why. I just knew I'd heard it connected to something I'd never been able to fully close. When I saw the satellite signatures on those contractor elements using his encrypted channels." He stopped, started again. "Tell me the full shape of it." And she was quiet for a moment. She folded the bandage she'd been working with and set it on the crate between them. "October 3rd, 1993, she said. "My grandfather was part of the operation in Mogadishu. He was present for everything that night, including something that wasn't in any mission parameter or after-action report. A group of Somali civilians moving through an evacuation corridor. They were shot. The order came from a CIA officer who had no operational authority in that theater, who was there with a group that had no official presence and no documentation. She paused. The order was given to protect that group's presence. My grandfather witnessed it. He was the ranking American at the location when it happened. And the CIA officer, Briggs said, was Frank Decker. She looked at the ground. He was 33 years old, junior enough to be aggressive, senior enough to have access. My grandfather was given the standard choice: disappear voluntarily or disappear through other means. He had a sister with a young daughter at home. He chose to disappear. Briggs processed this for a moment. Your mother is his sister. Yes, Patricia Ward. She married Daniel Calloway in 1991. I was born in 1993, a few weeks after Mogadishu. She paused. My grandfather never came home, but he didn't go far. He kept watch the way he knew how to keep watch from a distance without showing himself for as long as it took. And your father? Something changed in her voice. It didn't break. It became more specific, the voice of someone for whom a specific wound has scarred correctly, which means it holds, but the holding costs something. My father was a careful man, she said, patient. He believed in the right process applied with enough persistence. He spent 5 years building a documentation case, names, dates, coordinates, testimony from people who had been there. He was 6 weeks from filing the first disclosure when he died on a road in Virginia in 2012. She paused. The record says accident. The record is wrong. Decker. Yes. Briggs was quiet. After my father was killed, she continued, my grandfather came to find me. I was 19. I didn't know he existed. My mother had protected me from that knowledge my whole life because knowing would have made me a liability. He showed up at our door in the middle of winter and stood there in the cold and looked at me for a long time before he said anything. A pause. He said, I have been waiting to meet you. I'm sorry for everything that made the waiting necessary. Briggs looked at the sky. The sun was fully up now, washing the compound in the thin gold light that this province offered briefly each morning before the altitude, and the angle reduced it to something more functional. He trained you, Briggs said. It wasn't a question. 6 years, summers in the mountains, winters in Wyoming, where he had a small property that didn't appear on any documentation he hadn't deliberately arranged. He taught me everything he knew about the physical side weapons movement terrain, how to read a situation before it reads you. She looked at her hands. But the more important part was the documentation. My father had built the complete case, every name, every date, every piece of corroborating testimony. When my father was killed, that case didn't disappear. It transferred. To me. How? My father knew the risk he was taking. He spent the last year of the project preparing for the possibility that he wouldn't be the one to deliver it. He spent that year teaching me to memorize everything, every name, every coordinate, every testimony reference, the way my grandfather had taught him to memorize navigation waypoints in the field. Not as a list of facts, as a structure, a sequence with its own internal logic that could be reconstructed from any starting point. She paused. I am the documentation. There is no external record that can be seized or destroyed. The record is in here. She touched her temple. I've been carrying it for 7 years. Briggs let that sit. Your grandfather's plan, he said, the full architecture of it. He needed the documentation delivered to someone with institutional standing, someone credible enough that the receiving bodies couldn't dismiss it, someone with 30 years of operational record in the systems that Decker had spent 3 decades building walls inside. She looked at Briggs directly, and someone he trusted completely, someone who could not be bought or pressured, who had never given Decker any leverage, someone who had been carrying the weight of my grandfather's supposed death for 31 years and would therefore not stop no matter what was required. He could have contacted me directly, Briggs said. He said you would have come looking for him immediately. He said you would have put yourself between him and Decker before the evidence was positioned properly, and Decker would have used that to bury everything. She held his gaze. He said you were the most loyal person he had ever served with, and that your loyalty had to be protected from itself until the right moment. Briggs sat with that for a long time. The loyalty of it. The patience required to maintain a 31-year operation in which the most important person in the plan couldn't know he was in the plan. The ruthlessness of caring enough about someone to keep the truth from them until the truth could do what it needed to do. He almost said several things. He said, stubborn son of a gun. She said, he told me you'd say that. He looked at her. She was watching him with those eyes that were too accomplished, for 26 years, and he understood now where she had gotten them. Not from any single person, from a lineage from a grandfather who had chosen patience over presence, from a father who had chosen truth over safety, from a mother who had chosen protection over disclosure. She was the sum of all of them shaped by their losses and their purposes into something that was more than any one of them had been. She was exactly what Ghost had built. A burst of radio traffic from the operations center cut across the base frequency, sharp and urgent, and both of them returned to the present tense of the morning with the instant physical reorientation of people for whom a radio on an operational channel is never background noise. Vane's voice clipped and direct. Briggs, Ward, Operations Center, now. The Operations Center was running at a tempo that pressed against the available processing capacity of everyone inside it. On the primary screen, a satellite image of the terrain between the compound and FOB ridgeline. The terrain they had crossed 2 hours ago, now readable in the full light of morning. 11 heat signatures moving through it, moving toward them. Identified as private contractor element, Vane said with the particular quality of controlled urgency. Non-standard communication channels, CIA-level encrypted satellite protocol. He paused. Someone sent them. Holloway pulled a secondary screen forward, a communications intercept fragmentary the shape of a conversation without all its words. One phrase highlighted. Ward T confirmed status. Proceed as ordered. Briggs looked at it, looked at Vane, looked at her. She was reading the screen with an expression that was not surprise. It was the expression of someone watching an expected event arrive. Decker, she said. Vane said, you know this name. He's the reason for all of this. He's the reason my father is dead. He's the reason this mission was constructed the way it was constructed. She looked at Vane directly. I'm the objective, not the compound, not Forsyth, me. The mission was designed to create an operational context in which my death would be explicable as a combat casualty. The contractor element is the contingency for the scenario where I survive the compound. The room processed this. Kowalski had arrived in the doorway during the explanation and was listening with an expression that had passed through all its available iterations and arrived somewhere that had no name. The documentation you're carrying, Vane said. Decker knows it exists. He's known for years that my father built it and that it transferred when my father died. He's been trying to locate me for 4 years. She paused. He found me through this mission. Someone above your briefing room gave him the manifest. Vane looked at the 11 signatures, looked at the timeline, looked at the terrain. Before we address the defensive situation, he said, is there anything in your documentation that needs to leave this base before contact? She looked at him steadily. Yes. Tell me what you need. Your communications specialist in 20 minutes. Vane looked at Ashford, the communications specialist at the primary terminal. Ashford nodded. 20 minutes, Vane said. Then we prepare the position. She sat at the primary terminal. No external drive, no document file, no physical record of any kind. She began to type. Briggs stood at her shoulder and watched the content build itself line by line from her memory, and he understood as it accumulated the full scope of what her grandfather had spent 6 years teaching her. Not just the shooting, not just the movement and the tactics and the physical capacity to survive what she had just survived. He had taught her to be the archive itself, a living operational record of every name, every date, every coordinate, every testimony that her father had assembled across 5 years of careful, dangerous work, and that Decker had believed he had buried when he had Daniel Calloway killed on a Virginia road in 2012. She typed for 19 minutes without reference to any external source. When she finished, she looked at Ashford. 3 channels: Senate Intelligence Committee Secure Server, Senate Armed Services Committee Secure Server. And this address. She wrote a name and a Proton Mail address on a notepad. He's been covering classified accountability for 20 years. His source protection record is documented. His lawyer has standing instructions. Ashford looked at the transmission volume, looked at the committee names, looked at the address on the pad. He started to say something. Send it, she said. He sent it. 4 minutes later, 3 green confirmation indicators on the screen. 3 channels received. She sat with it for a moment. The quality of a person who has been moving toward a single point for a very long time and has arrived there and is learning what arrival feels like from the inside. She stood up. If anyone asks you about this transmission, she said to Ashford, tell them exactly what happened. Exactly. Nothing softened, nothing elaborated. He nodded. She walked back out into the morning cold. Briggs fell in beside her. 26 minutes, he said. I know, she said. They went to their positions. Vane reconfigured the base in 11 minutes. Personnel not part of the defensive element moved to the hardened communication structure at the compound's center. Mercer Ambulatoriate at reduced capacity made his position clear to Vane with a look that didn't invite disagreement, and Vane accepted it and assigned him the gap between the gate and the medical building, a gap that would otherwise have been the most exploitable angle in the defense. She came to Briggs with 3 specific recommendations stated concisely and, without preamble, cover the northeast personnel gate, which the approaching element's most probable axis of advance would use as its primary breach point. Establish observation at the water tower on the compound's south side for the only available elevation advantage inside the perimeter. Disable the generator powering the eastern floodlights, which were currently illuminating the interior while doing nothing for visibility outside the walls. Vane listened, looked at the map, implemented all 3. Kowalski was assigned the water tower. He looked at the assignment for half a second, looked at her, went to the water tower without comment, not the silence of resentment, but the silence of a man who has updated a file and is operating from the updated version. Briggs took the northeast gate. She stayed mobile. Contact began at 0614. First to sound the footfall pattern of a disciplined element moving at pace across rocky terrain, differentiated from ambient noise by ears that had spent careers learning to make that specific distinction. Then the crack and thump of a breach charge on the northeast gate. The gate held 4 seconds before it gave. What came through was organized and professional in the way private contractor elements with military pedigrees are professional. The measured, systematic application of force by people who had been trained in its efficient use and were applying that training for compensation rather than conviction. That distinction is operational, not moral. People who fight for conviction don't recalculate risk. People who fight for compensation carry an internal accounting ledger that becomes accessible under the right conditions. Vane understood this. He had built the defense accordingly. The first exchange established the geometry. 11 contractor personnel, equipped and trained, moving and practiced 2-man fire teams. FOB Ridgeline had 7 active defenders, 1 wounded corpsman, 1 compromised specialist, and a layout that offered more cover than the approaching element had anticipated. The northeast section of the compound became the focal point within the first minute. Briggs was at the gate with Sheen on his left. The engagement was close enough that distance became irrelevant, and everything reduced to a series of immediate successive decisions made at a speed that bypassed deliberate thought and drew entirely on trained response. 2 coming over the north wall, 30 meters, moving right. Her voice from somewhere he hadn't located yet. Level and precise as instrument readout. He didn't turn to find her. He trusted the information and acted on it because 31 years had taught him that the first requirement of working alongside someone capable was knowing when to stop verifying and start responding. Sheen pivoted right. Briggs held the gate. She appeared at the base of the compound wall in his peripheral vision, moving low and fluid toward a position covering both the wall breach and the secondary approach lane along the interior east side. Her left arm was working at reduced load, the compensation distributed through her torso and right side with the natural adjustment of someone trained to function through physical limitation. From the water tower, 2 shots from Kowalski, precise. Across the compound, Holloway managed the flanking attempt from the south vehicle access. Vane directed the overall engagement from the operations center, maintaining the satellite uplink simultaneously. Mercer was at the corner of the medical building, covering his assigned gap at diminished speed with complete operational attention, the proof that what had been built in preparation had been built correctly. She moved through the engagement the way current moves through a circuit toward the points of highest need before the need had been verbally identified. A flanking attempt on Holloway's position, she was there before Holloway called for support, having read the movement and projected the trajectory. A second breach attempt at the northwest corner, she was already repositioning because she had read the terrain and understood that the northwest corner was the logical secondary option after the primary approach encountered resistance. Then the engagement reached its critical point. The round that found Mercer came from the north wall breach. It took him in the same leg higher than the first wound above the original tourniquet. He went down in the open in the gap between the perimeter wall and the medical building, equidistant from 3 separate threat axes and without immediate cover. She was 30 feet away when it happened. She moved toward him directly through the engagement geometry rather than around it, because the alternative was watching him bleed out in the open, and that was not a thing she was going to do. She reached him and dropped. The wound was pumping upper femoral segment, the kind of hemorrhage that counts its tolerance in seconds. Her right hand went into the wound before she was fully settled, applying direct pressure at the correct location, and she had a second tourniquet out of her kit with her left hand, the shoulder objecting to the load with a pain she processed and set aside, and applied it single-handed above the wound site with the specific mechanical efficiency of someone for whom the technique existed below the threshold of deliberate thought. North wall breach. Two figures moving through it. Her right hand stayed on Mercer. Her left took the M4, 40 meters. She put both of them down and returned her left hand to the tourniquet, completing the placement and checking the lock without at any point stopping either action. Kowalski appeared at the corner of the medical building. He had been behind her. He was in front of her now, covering the breach point. He had read the geometry and compensated without being told. She looked at Mercer's face. Bad color, but holding. Eyes open. You are not going to die in this courtyard. Not reassurance. Assessment. The voice of someone who meant exactly what they said and had never meant anything different. He believed her. It was visible. She maintained pressure for 90 seconds, completed the wound management, satisfied herself about his stability, and returned to the engagement. Kowalski watched her stand. He said nothing. He turned back to the breach. But his bearing had shifted in some way that Briggs could see even from a distance, releasing a slight settling as though something that had been held since the briefing room had finally been set down. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. At its end, 3 contractor personnel had been incapacitated from the water tower. 2 more had gone down at the northeast gate. The remaining 6 had pulled back to a holding position outside the perimeter, not retreating, not advancing, reassessing. That reassessment was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Frank Decker. His vehicle stopped outside the primary access gate. A single transmission on the contractor channel. 3 words. The remaining 6 personnel went to full stop. Vane received the transmission simultaneously. He looked at Briggs, looked at her. She was standing in the center of the compound, left arm against her side, right hand at her weapon. Her face held something Briggs had not seen on it before. Not anger, not fear, but the quality of someone who has been walking toward a specific point for a very long time and has covered the final distance. He's requesting a dialogue, Vane said. He's requesting a surrender, she said. Let him think that's what this is. Vane looked at her for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio and told the gate to stand by. Decker was 61 years old and carried his years the way men carry decades spent in authority, with the particular uprightness of someone who has been treated as correct for long enough that the posture has become structural. He walked through the primary gate with 2 of his personnel flanking and the remaining 4 holding externally, and he moved through the compound the way he moved through every space he entered, as though it had been arranged for him. Briggs had not seen him in 6 years. He looked the same. Older but recognizably the same man from the briefing rooms and the operational reviews in the memorial services. The quiet, consequential conversations in which other people's fates were discussed by men with the authority to discuss them. The man who had stood beside Briggs at James Ward's memorial service 31 years ago and wept with what appeared to be genuine grief. The man Briggs had stood next to in the cold and the silence of the rifle volley and believed was carrying the same loss. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for 31 years. He held the full weight of that now in the compound in the morning light, watching Decker's eyes cross the space and find her. What crossed Decker's face when he found her, Briggs had expected many things. Triumph, satisfaction, the expression of a man completing an operation he had been running for years. What he saw was different. It was the face of a man who has been maintaining a specific architecture for 31 years and is standing in the presence of its ending. Not relief, the opposite of relief, in the direction of exhaustion rather than release. The face of a man discovering that what he had been carrying had never been as light as he had managed to make it feel. He had looked at Briggs' face across briefing tables and memorial services and institutional hallways for 3 decades, and in Briggs' face he had been reading the full cost of the order he had given on a road in Mogadishu in 1993. The cost had never gone away. It had accumulated year by year in the unchanged grief of a man who believed his failure had caused a death that had in fact been engineered. Briggs had been Decker's accounting ledger for 31 years without knowing it. He filed this, locked the file. What came next required everything. You're James Ward's girl, Decker said. I'm Patricia Ward's daughter, she said. A pause. Your grandfather was the most capable operator I encountered in 30 years of this work. That's not sentiment, it's an accurate professional assessment. He held her gaze. It's why it had to be done the way it was done. My father spent 5 years building the documentation, she said. You know what it contains? I know what it contains. Then you know there are 4 names besides yours. 2 of them are currently in positions with operational authority. Yes. And you know the documentation is complete enough to support prosecution of all 5. Decker was quiet in the way of a man watching a structure he spent 31 years maintaining become no longer structurally viable. Who has it? He said. It left this base 90 minutes ago. 3 separate channels. 2 Senate committees and a journalist with a 20-year record of source protection and standing legal instructions. She paused. It's done. The only remaining question is what happens to the people named in it. Briggs watched Decker process this. He had seen men process the end of things in many ways, with denial, with the kind of cold violence that believes action can reverse what has already occurred, with the particular danger of people who have decided that if they cannot preserve what they built, they can at minimum damage what replaces it. What he saw on Decker's face was something different and something he had not expected. Not the calculation of a man assessing remaining options, the particular quality of a man who has been exhausted by a long effort and has encountered at the end of it the moment when the effort stops being necessary, not peace. Something that had been waiting behind the effort for 31 years and was now finally allowed to be present. Decker looked at his 2 flanking personnel. He said 2 words. They lowered their weapons. He held out his hands. Vane came forward with the restraints, and the thing that had taken 31 years to arrive completed itself in the time it took to close a zip tie. Vane handled the post-operational sequence with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Communications went out on the proper channels. The chain of custody documentation was assembled correctly. A helicopter from higher command was inbound with personnel to take the next layer of the problem off his hands. Briggs went to the medical bay. Mercer was on a cot, leg elevated, color better than it had been 2 hours ago, managing pain without enough medication to eliminate it by choice because being alert mattered more than being comfortable. How bad is the leg? Briggs said. I'll walk out of here. Eventually. He looked at the ceiling. She found the chest injury before we left. If she hadn't, he stopped, started again. 4 years, 4 countries. I know what good looks like. What she does, that's not what that is. No, Briggs said, it's not. Who is she? Briggs considered how to answer that truthfully without giving what wasn't his to give. She's exactly what this situation needed, he said. Mercer was young enough that this landed as wisdom rather than deflection. He looked back at the ceiling, and whatever he was working through, he worked through it quietly. She found Briggs outside the medical bay an hour later. The base had reached post-operational equilibrium, not quiet, but carrying the functional texture of activity that follows a crisis. People processing what had happened while attending to what still needed doing. Decker and the contractor element were secured. Transmission confirmations verified. Higher command inbound. She sat down beside him, and for a while neither of them spoke. The transmissions confirmed, she said eventually. All 3 channels. I know. It's done. The 2 words carried something quieter and more interior than triumph. The quality of arriving at a destination that has defined the approach for so long that arrival itself needs a moment to be absorbed. Your father would have, Briggs started. I know what he would have, she said gently. The gentleness of someone who has had every version of this conversation internally and doesn't need to have it aloud again. He stopped. He was good, she said after a moment. Patient, careful. He believed that the right process applied with enough persistence would produce the right outcome. She looked at her hands. He was right about everything, and it cost him everything, and I spent 4 years learning to hold both of those facts simultaneously without one canceling the other. Briggs said nothing. Some things don't need a response. They need a witness. My grandfather told me, she continued, that the hardest part wouldn't be the physical training. He said the hardest part would be learning what to do with what you feel about what the work requires. He said that's what breaks most people. Not the physical part, the part where you understand what it was and you do it anyway. He was right, Briggs said. He was usually right. A pause. It was genuinely annoying. He laughed. Brief arrived from somewhere he hadn't expected it and carrying no residue of the weight he had been carrying for 31 years. Clean laughter, the kind that only comes when something that has been compressed for a long time is finally released. She looked at him when he laughed. He looked at her. She was James Ward's granddaughter. She was Patricia Ward's daughter. She was the sum of Daniel Calloway's patient courage and Ghost Ward's disciplined waiting and 31 years of architecture built by a man who understood that the only operations that couldn't be compromised were the ones in which no one knew the full picture until the final phase. She was 26 years old, and she had steady hands and still eyes, and a mind that ran tactical analysis and medical assessment simultaneously at a speed that most people never reached in either direction alone. She was exactly what Ghost had said she was, in the single marked page of the final book, in the single word written in pencil so faint it was almost invisible. She was Tessa. A vehicle pulled through the main gate. Higher command had arrived early. Brigadier General Owen Stratford was 58 years old, rangy, and weathered in the way of men who had spent decades making difficult decisions in outdoor conditions, and he walked through FOB Ridgeline's operations center, reading the situation the way very senior officers read situations comprehensively, without visible judgment, filing what mattered. 20 minutes with Vane, 7 with Briggs. He read the transmission confirmations and Decker's preliminary detention documentation and the chain of custody file that Vane had assembled with the thoroughness of someone who understood this particular record would be examined for a long time by a great many people. Then he found her. She was in the medical bay for the surgical referral evaluation, and she stood when he entered. He told her to sit, and she sat. He read for 2 minutes, closed the folder. Corseman Ward. Sir, I have a complete operational report from Captain Vane. Supplementary observations from Chief Briggs. A medical record indicating you conducted continuous combat operations for approximately 9 hours with 2 penetrating injuries. He paused. And transmission confirmations on a data set that will require a significant portion of the Senate Intelligence Committee's attention for the foreseeable future. She said nothing. I knew your grandfather's reputation, Stratford said. Not personally, I was too junior at the time, and he was too classified. But his name was one of those names, the ones that come up when people who know things try to explain to people who don't what a very specific kind of excellence looks like. He paused. I understand now how that name has persisted. He stood. He brought his right hand up. The salute was not general to petty officer. It was one professional to another, across all the distances of rank and generation in the language the military uses when words are not adequate. She came to attention and returned it. He held it for 2 seconds. Then he lowered his hand and turned toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. The curriculum you build, he said without turning back, make sure it reaches the people who need it most, not just the people who already know they need it. The system routes resources toward the already capable. That's not where the leverage is. He walked out. She sat down. She looked at her hands. Steady, both of them. Kowalski found her 20 minutes later in the corridor outside the medical bay. He was not in his operational posture. He was carrying his helmet and standing the way men stand when they have decided to do something that does not come naturally to them and have decided to do it anyway because it is correct. At the briefing, he said, at the equipment check, on the approach. He held her gaze. I made a judgment before I had the information. Then I held the judgment after the information started coming in. That's not how I was trained to operate. He didn't look away. I'm sorry. She was quiet for a moment. You covered Mercer's tourniquet when I needed 2 hands elsewhere, she said. You didn't hesitate, and you didn't ask for an explanation. That's what mattered. He looked like he wanted to dispute the adequacy of that as resolution. She didn't give him the opening. Cover the north position better on the next one. There were 2 seconds where you were tracking the wrong angle. He stared at her. Yes, ma'am, he said. He meant it without reservation. He walked back to his position. Briggs watched him go. He'll be different after this, she said. Most people are, Briggs said. 6 months later, Camp Pendleton on the California coast was doing what it did in April, reminding anyone who had forgotten that it knew how to be beautiful when it chose to. The hills above the base were green from the late rains, and the Pacific showed at the western horizon as a strip of hard blue, and the air at 700 carried the quality of a beginning. There were 18 of them in the room. Navy corpsmen and Army combat medics, ages 22 to 31, from 7 different units and 4 branches of service. Selected through a process that Vane had helped design and Stratford had helped resource, and that had taken 6 months to construct from the operational report filed at FOB Ridgeline the previous October. The board at the front of the room read Integrated Combat Medicine Cohort 1. Tessa Ward stood at the front in her working uniform, left shoulder fully recovered and carrying its complete range of motion again after the surgery and the physical therapy and the discipline of letting a body heal at the pace it required rather than the pace she wanted it to. She had gained back the weight she had lost. The hollows under her eyes had filled. She looked like someone who had passed through something significant and had come out intact, not unchanged, but intact, which is the better outcome. Mercer sat at the front right table, still on crutches a month from being clear of them, assigned to the training cohort at his own request and present because she had found the problem in his chest before it found him, and because that had made him an advocate in the specific way people who owe their lives become advocates completely without reservation for the full extent of what that advocacy is worth. She looked at the 18 people in the room. She had prepared something, written it out, revised it, thought carefully about the right length and register. She set it aside. You were selected because someone in your command believes you can do two things simultaneously, she said. Not in sequence, not on alternating days. Two things at the same moment with both hands under conditions designed to make one thing difficult. She let that land. The assumption is that this represents exceptional capacity. It doesn't, it's trained capacity. The training is hard, and the application is harder, and there will be moments in the field when everything in you insists you have to choose between them. She paused. You don't. That's what the next 8 weeks are for. The room was quiet. Heal when you can, she said. Fight when you must. Those aren't competing instructions. They are one instruction. Understanding that takes time. That's why we're here. She looked at Mercer. He gave her a nod that was small, precise, and carried 32 separate things in it, none of which required articulation. She turned to the curriculum. That evening in the room she kept at base housing, she sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before making the call. Her mother answered on the second ring with the particular quality of someone who has spent years waiting for calls that might carry difficult news and has learned to answer quickly rather than let the waiting extend. It's me, Tessa said. I know it's you. The voice had the texture of someone who had been through enough to have become irrevocably herself. Are you all right? I'm all right. A pause that passed information between people who knew each other well enough for silence to carry weight. The first class started today, Tessa said. I know, Roland told me. Briggs had been calling her mother. She hadn't known that. Is that all right? She said. He was your grandfather's closest friend for 22 years. He can call anyone he chooses. A pause. He also has excellent phone manners. Your grandfather could have learned from him in that regard. Tessa smiled despite herself. Mom, she said. Yes. I broke the promise. She had said variations of this before, but she needed to say it again in the specific context of right now, 6 months past the event, with the full weight of what the breaking had cost and what it had accomplished, both present and accounted for. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Your father asked me to keep you away from all of it. He was right to ask, and I was right to want it. We were both right. He saw a pause. And your grandfather was right to prepare you anyway. He was right about what was coming, even when I couldn't see it coming myself. Another pause. 3 right people, 3 different answers. That's not a situation that permits a clean resolution, Tessa. It never was. I know. Your grandfather called me, her mother said. Her voice changed register, not softer but deeper. Carrying something that had been held a long time. 3 years ago. I don't know how he found the number. He called once, said 4 sentences, and I never heard from him again. A pause. He said, I know you're afraid. I know you're right to be afraid. But the girl she's becoming is more than what I made her. She comes from more than me. Tessa sat with that. Outside the window, the California dark was warm and clear, in the way April California dark can be, carrying the particular quality of a night that has nothing to prove. He was right about that too, her mother said. They talked for 20 minutes about the texture of ordinary life, her mother's work, the late rains, a book she was reading, Anaïs Beer's the specific quality of morning light lately, the world persisting in its ordinary way. Which it did, which it always did, which was finally the point. When they said goodnight, her mother said, come home when you can. I will. She put the phone down. She looked at the box on the shelf. Briggs had brought it 2 weeks earlier, carrying it with the specific care of someone transporting something fragile in a way unrelated to its physical composition. He had set it on her table and stood back from it and told her what it was in a few sentences that were exactly the sentences needed, leaving aside everything that was elaboration. 9 books. She had known about the books. Her grandfather had described them during the 4th year of her training one winter evening on a high slope in Wyoming, while the weather made outdoor work impossible. He had described them as the only communication he allowed himself, the only thread between himself and the world he had left, because the thread ran to one person, and even that thread he had constructed in a language only the 2 of them knew, so that if the books were ever found, the finding would be inconclusive. She opened the first one. The markings were faint. She had to tilt the page to catch the light at the right angle. She had the cipher he had taught it to her during that same winter on the high slope, working through each symbol with the patience of someone who understood that this was the most important lesson he would teach, and that it could not be rushed. She read through each book slowly. There was no longer any reason to hurry. The first three were contact signals, the private language of a man telling another man across years and distance, "I am still here. I have not forgotten what we were to each other." This thread remains. The middle books were more specific. Observations. The careful cataloging of someone who had spent 30 years watching the world from outside it, tracking the movement of certain people and certain institutions, maintaining the patient vigil of someone who had made a decision about how long the waiting would last and was holding to that decision. And always beneath the operational content, something else. Not operational at all. You deserve to know the truth. The truth was not mine to give safely. I am sorry for the shape this required. She read that passage 3 times. The eighth book contained what she had expected: the architecture, the threading of the needle that had taken a decade to thread, the arrangements for Briggs, the construction of the operational context that would bring them to the same compound, in the same province, in the same October. The discipline required to wait for all elements to align, and the patience required not to force the alignment before it was ready. She read it with the recognition of someone reading a map of terrain already crossed. She had known he was deliberate. She had not known the full dimensions of the deliberateness. She had not known how many years it had taken to position each piece of what had been finally a single operation conducted across a decade by a man who could not show his face and who had never, not for a single day of those 10 years, stopped working. The ninth book, 1 page marked. She had known this was coming. Briggs had described it. She had carried the knowledge of it for 2 weeks and had not opened the ninth book until tonight, because she had understood, without being able to articulate why, that it needed to be opened at the right moment, rather than the convenient one. She tilted the page to the light. The word was almost invisible. Lead gray pencil on gray paper, aged by years of handling and time. Surviving by the stubbornness of things that need to survive. Her name. Just her name. She sat with it for a long time. The room was quiet. The April dark was outside the window. Somewhere on the base, 18 people were beginning in their sleep to process what they had started learning today, that the most important thing was not choosing correctly between the options available, but refusing to accept that the choice was binary in the first place. Her grandfather had understood this. He had understood it about medicine and weapons and loyalty, and the kind of love that operates at distance in the dark without acknowledgement for as long as it takes. He had built her. And in building her, he had made himself legible in a way that no direct communication could have achieved, because the best evidence of what a person was, finally, is not what they said, but what they made. She closed the ninth book. She placed it back in the box with the others. She looked at her hands. 3 weeks after that evening, a combat medic at Fort Bragg attended a conference at which Mercer presented. She wrote in her evaluation form, in the section asking for the single most important concept from the session, a phrase she had heard Mercer use: drag them out alive. By June, it was on the wall of 3 training facilities in 2 states. Briggs saw it for the first time in a photograph Holloway sent from Fort Campbell, with no accompanying message, which was exactly the right amount of message for what the photograph conveyed. He printed it and put it on the shelf next to the box of 9 books. It seemed right that they should be together. The Senate Intelligence Committee opened its formal inquiry 6 weeks after the October transmission. The documentation was complete enough that the preliminary phase was brief. The 4 names beyond Decker's, 2 of them still carrying operational authority, were placed on administrative hold within the same week. Decker entered a plea agreement that included full cooperation and produced 7 additional names. 3 of them Briggs recognized. 1 of them he had trusted. The journalist published in January, after the committees provided the limited clearance required to contextualize the classified elements. The piece named Decker and named the 4 and named what had happened in Mogadishu on the night of October 3, 1993, the order that should never have been given the civilians who had died because of it, the 31 years of institutional architecture constructed to ensure that the giving of that order would never be formally documented. It did not name Tessa Ward. It did not name James Ward. It did not mention Phoba Ridgeline or the Kunar province or what had occurred there in October. It didn't need to. Vane sent Briggs a text message the morning the piece published. 3 words. Briggs read it, set the phone down, and sat with what he felt for a while, because what he felt was not something with a simple name. He had spent 31 years carrying at a specific weight, and now that weight had been resolved, and the space where it had been was not empty, it was occupied by something he was still learning to recognize. He called Patricia Ward Calloway that afternoon. She had read the piece. She was quiet on the phone for a long time after they finished discussing what needed to be discussed. Then she said she had always known in the part of herself that her husband's death hadn't been able to reach, that the people responsible would eventually be accountable. Knowing that had been the thing that kept her from letting the weight of it collapse her. She asked how Briggs was. He told her the truth. He said he didn't know yet. She said that was the right answer. They talked for 30 minutes. He had good phone manners. She appreciated them. They agreed to talk again. On a Tuesday morning in May, Tessa Ward stood in front of her second cohort, 22 people, this time selected from 8 units. 4 of them women, the oldest, 41 years old, with 3 combat deployments and a Purple Heart, and the specific kind of attention in his eyes that belongs to people who have learned from direct experience that the difference between a good medic and an exceptional one is measured in lives. She was 26 years old, and she had steady hands and still eyes and a shoulder that had healed completely and did not ache even in the cold. The briefing for the next deployment was at 0800 the following morning. A different province, a different mission, set a different set of variables requiring a different application of the same fundamental understanding that the two things were not two things, that the hands that could heal and the hands that could protect were the same hands, and that the only question was whether the person attached to those hands had been trained to use them that way. She had been. She stood in front of the 22 people who were going to be. She thought of her grandfather on a high slope in Wyoming, working through each symbol of a cipher by the light of a lantern, patient in the way of someone who had learned that the important things could not be rushed without becoming less than important. She thought of her father, careful and persistent, building a record that outlasted the effort to destroy it. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone in April, carrying the particular depth of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had arrived at last at the other side of the fear. She thought of Roland Briggs, 62 years old, carrying a weight for 31 years that had never been his to carry, and carrying it anyway because that was what loyalty looked like when it had nowhere constructive to go. She thought of one word in pencil on one page of one book, her name. Not a message exactly, not an instruction, simply an acknowledgement from a man who had given everything available to him to a long operation conducted in darkness, that she was the point of it, that she had always been the point of it, that the patience and the distance and the 31 years of careful, invisible work had been organized around a single simple fact that she existed, and that what existed in her was worth everything it had cost to protect. She turned to the board. She picked up the marker. She wrote 4 words: heal, fight, never choose. She looked at 22 people who were going to carry those words into places she would never see and apply them in situations she would never know about. And she understood that this was not a diminishment of what had been built here. This was the point. This was how something outlasts the person who built it. This was legacy, not the shots taken, not the names in the record, but the wisdom moving outward from its origin and becoming in its movement larger than its origin had been. She was 26 years old. She was Ghost Ward's granddaughter. She was Patricia Ward's daughter and Daniel Calloway's daughter, and the sum of everyone who had carried something forward in the dark so that she could stand in the light and pass it on. She was ready. She had always been ready. Let's begin, she said, and they began.